Joining us now, NBC's Raf Sanchez, who's in Jerusalem for us, and Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. So, Raf, of course, anytime we hear about an attack on the embassy in Beirut, it brings to mind the horrors of the 80s when in 1983, the embassy, the predecessor embassy to this one, was bombed, previously. I think it was 241 Marines and other personnel were killed. And that was a turning point in U.S. policy in the Middle East. What else do we know about this attack at a time when the U.S. is desperately trying not to have a northern front opened, which would vastly expand this war?
Yeah, Andrea, your point about the 1983 attack is well made. The American embassy in Beirut is actually outside of the city now in a mountainous area in a very heavily fortified compound for exactly that security reason. They do not want to see another attack like what they saw in 1983. Today's attack, not on the same scale, but here's what we know. 8:34 a.m. local time, gunfire erupted outside the entrance to the embassy. Lebanese media says the shootout lasted for about 30 minutes. And in just the last couple of minutes, NBC News has been able to verify a photograph of the gunman outside of the embassy that we may be able to bring up here. You can see on your screen there, he is helmeted, he is masked, he is carrying a Kalashnikov assault rifle, and he's wearing a tactical vest. Now, in another image that we're not able to share because it's too graphic, the gunman, after he has been injured by Lebanese forces and taken into custody, you can see on that vest, he has the letters in English, IS, written, which is a possible reference to the Islamic State, to ISIS. We don't know for sure at this moment his motivation, but we do know that this is a moment when there is very widespread anger across the Middle East directed at the United States because of American support for Israel since October 7th and during the war in Gaza. And as you mentioned, Andrea, this is also coming at a time when the fighting between Israel and the Iranian-backed militant group in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah, has been intensifying. Earlier this week, there were pretty serious fires in northern Israel caused by rocket fire. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is under real domestic pressure to be seen to be doing something in the north. And Israel's government has basically said that the window is open for now for a diplomatic solution for Hezbollah to pull back away from the Israeli border to stop firing, but that if it doesn't, Israel will move ahead with a military offensive in southern Lebanon. And that really has the potential to unleash a war that could be far, far more devastating than what we've seen in Gaza. Hezbollah is a much larger, much more powerful group than Hamas. There was a deadly war between Israel back in 2006, Israel and Hezbollah back in 2006, which led to a lot of civilian casualties in Lebanon, a lot of civilian casualties in Israel, and the White House working very hard to try to prevent that war from erupting again. Andrew?
Yeah, I was there in 2006, and it was, a dreadful war on both sides and devastated Lebanon, which is one reason why it's believed that Hezbollah has not wanted to engage, at least immediately after October 7th. Ben, the CIA Director Bill Burns back in Qatar, but the talks haven't really resumed. This is trying to push Hamas to embrace the proposal, which they said was positive initially. And also, of course, a lot of pressure on Netanyahu, who endorsed it with the war cabinet before Friday's announcement by President Biden, but then started backing off of it under pressure from his right wing. The politics in Israel are so complicated right now.
Yeah, you have to remember on both sides of this negotiation, there are multiple actors. So first of all, with respect to Hamas, there's a political leadership in Qatar that is more susceptible to pressure from the U.S. government from Qatar. These are people that live outside of Gaza. These are people that have money that the U.S. goes after in different parts of the world. Meanwhile, the commander on the ground in Gaza, Sinwar, thus far, he seems to want a kind of open-ended war in which Hamas gains international support, in which Hamas can kind of mount an insurgency against Israeli forces inside of Gaza. So it's no guarantee that even if the political leadership in Hamas supports a ceasefire agreement, that the people fighting on the ground in Gaza will similarly sign off. A similar dynamic, Andrea, on the other side of this, in the Israeli government, that war cabinet reflects the more center to center right elements of the Israeli government. You've got people like Benny Gantz, you've got people like the defense minister Gallant, who've been willing to kind of put pressure on Netanyahu to wind down the war, to have a credible plan for Gaza. On the other hand, you have ministers, very senior ministers in the government, the finance minister, the national security minister in the Israeli government, who are very openly hostile to the ceasefire agreement and have said that they would bring down the Israeli government if it moves forward. And that's probably why Prime Minister Netanyahu has not publicly embraced what the U.S. is describing as kind of his own plan. And so it's just a reminder here that there's more than two puzzle pieces that have to be fit together here, Andrea. This is a multi-dimensional negotiation, even among the Israeli and Palestinian partners. It's not clear that you have Israeli agreement for its own proposal at the political level, and not clear that you have Hamas agreement, particularly down at that military level for this proposal.
And there's, of course, the tension between Biden and Netanyahu, which was not helped by what the president said. He was trying to say to Time magazine, he's got political pressures. And of course, he's dealing people. It's safe to say that people deal with those pressures, but it was not taken very well in Tel Aviv that he was referring to that. And when Gabe Gutierrez asked him at an event yesterday, do you think that the prime minister is trying to hold on to office for political reasons? He said, no, I think he's dealing with a very complicated situation, trying to clean that up. At the same time, we understand that the Speaker of the House, within the hour, or already perhaps, has been speaking to Netanyahu to firm up a date for that meeting, the joint meeting that he's coming to, which is something the White House is not welcoming, but they have no choice because he was invited by the Speaker, Schumer in the Senate, the Democratic leadership in the Senate, agreed to it. So that's coming up. He'll be here in Washington speaking to Congress. You know what happened last time when you were in office, and he gave a speech against the White House and against the Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that trigger certain memories, Andrea. First of all, just its decision to go public with the ceasefire proposal. One of the things that happened in the Obama years when there were negotiations with the Palestinian Authority is oftentimes, Israeli negotiators would indicate support for a certain proposal, but then Prime Minister Netanyahu wouldn't stand behind that proposal. And so in the first case, I do think part of the reason for going forward, even though they kept describing it an Israeli proposal, even though they keep putting the onus on Hamas to agree to it, is I think this is an administration that's been negotiating for many weeks, if not months, and just wants to say, okay, if you won't own your own proposal, we're just going to tell the world what your negotiators have agreed to. And I think that indicates probably a degree of frustration with Netanyahu. Why is the U.S. the one that's going out and presenting Israeli proposals? Well, it's because the Israeli prime minister doesn't want to do that because he knows then he'd have a fight with his far right, which means that he might not be able to stay in power, which is what Joe Biden was referring to, something I think we've all believed, which is it just is a matter of analysis. When the war ends, it's likely that there'll be an election in Israel, and maybe Netanyahu might not win that election. On Congress, I mean, Andrea, it's just very strange. I can't think of any other time in which, foreign leaders negotiated their appearances directly with the Speaker of the House of the opposing party. It's just not something that happens. And it's obviously something that happened in the Obama years. We weren't even notified that then Speaker John Boehner was inviting Netanyahu to give a speech against Barack Obama's foreign policy to the U.S. Congress. Frankly, I think it's a little strange that the Democratic leaders signed on here, in part because of this policy dispute. You're giving Netanyahu a huge platform to probably take policy positions that are different from the Biden administration. But even just politically, the Republican Party will likely be unified and rolling out the red carpet for Netanyahu, and the Democratic Party will be divided. And so this is the dynamic that Netanyahu has thrived on for many years, his kind of willingness to interfere in U.S. politics and kind of use support from Republicans as a source of leverage against Democrats. Unfortunately, the stakes are incredibly high, not just for Israel, but for the United States itself in Gaza. And that's why this is such an unusual dynamic, to say the least.